to the Keeping Friendship Magic podcast with your host, Forward Progress. Hello and welcome to the Keeping Friendship Magic podcast for our premiere episode. This is the podcast where fandom and social science meet to build a better tomorrow. I am joined this evening, as it is when we are recording, by two good friends of mine who will help our discussion for this episode. First, I'd like to introduce Nova Rose, fandom artist.
Hello, I'm Nova Rose. I'm Jared's best friend.
Oh, goodness. And fiance. And our second guest today, you know him as half of Riff Ponies, leading crazy panels with kazoos and riffing and questionable drinks of ranch dressing. It is Thoth Penswell.
I've embraced the suffering. Hi, I'm Thoth Penswell. I'm the less talented half of Riff Ponies. I'd like to welcome you to the show. And with that, I will quit my ASMRing voice. Pardon if I sound a bit dead. Currently getting over a bit of a cold and the last remnants of laryngitis, which I'm sure is what you all want to hear on a podcast about keeping friendship magic. But nonetheless, very happy to be here, very happy to be talking, and I promise you I will not blow a kazoo into that microphone for the rest of this podcast.
Only you would have had the kazoo at the ready.
Embrace the chaos.
Oh, of course. I've embraced the darkness. Just...
Oh gosh, this sounds like a Equestria Girls villain song already. Alrighty, so
I'm an Equestria girl.
We all are, and in our hearts and our souls. I think we can all agree to that.
And,
all right. So this week, our topic at large is going to be on fandom reactionism. Now, what do we mean by fandom reactionism? Well, what we're going to talk about essentially is the way that communities, whether through social media, conventions, overall discussion, have reacted to big events that have happened recently in our fandom communities, with big media giants that have had some serious endings to their franchises recently. So actually, with that, let's dig right into that. So 2019 was an interesting year, as a friend pointed out to me recently, because some of the most historic franchises of the last decade and beyond came to some serious ends this year, whether it be Game of Thrones, the initial Thanos saga of Avengers, and then we also saw the conclusion of the Skywalker saga of Star Wars, and of course, My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic having its final episode. So I'll bring this out to everybody. How anything from this year, from the endings of these series, really just kind of impact you personally?
An absolute loathing of Game of Thrones.
Speaking on the part of Game of Thrones, if we're going to tackle that one first, I just, not even out of a deliberate effort, Game of Thrones kind of just passed me by for the last few years. I've never been big on high fantasy. I say that as I have a bunch of colorful horses right in front of me, but nonetheless, never been a huge fan of high fantasy. I like Lord of the Rings. I like all of that. I didn't really watch Game of Thrones, and I remember the weekend, the Sunday night of when the finale was airing, I was at a friend's house in New York City at their apartment, and I remember they kept saying, "Oh, this Game of Thrones finale is tonight." And I had the choice at some point in that conversation where I had a choice that night, rather, where I could have gone home early, got a decent amount of sleep, or I could have stayed there and made the first episode that I ever watched of Game of Thrones be the last episode. and once my friend there kind of got wind of that and rolled it around in his head, he's like, you have a very interesting opportunity right here. Because you could be that guy in 10, 15, 20 years who said, the first episode I watched of Game of Thrones was the last one when it aired. And I said, I kind of like the ring to that. So I watched the last episode first. And I legitimately, my perspective is weird, wonky, obviously, because I know very little Game of Thrones. I liked the visuals. I like how it looked. I liked certain shots of it. There was some shot at the beginning of it where I went, "Oh my god, that's great!" And I had like never seen any of Game of Thrones, so I had no prior knowledge. But hearing from a lot of friends and a lot of other people who were really passionately into it, and them kind of describe what happened with the writing, I definitely could sit there and go, "Oh yeah, I could see why if you got that invested in it, if that sudden turn happened in the writing, that it would make somebody who is really passionate about it upset." And that's a point I'm probably going to hit at multiple times tonight. But when you invest that much in a piece of media like that, I can definitely see why people would, when it would noticeably change, or when it would turn away from the direction it was going, why that would upset people. But for me, I didn't know much of Game of Thrones, so I just watched from the side with my box of popcorn, I guess.
Well, it's kind of interesting because it seems like it essentially had, or it suffered the same fate as Star Wars, with like how Star Wars had a change of directors twice over.
I was gonna say,
so like
I was gonna say
J.J.
multiple
Abrams
changes
too.
in direction.
Yeah, so it's just like, and then kind of the same thing happened with Game of Thrones, where the book series stopped, so they essentially had to kind of create their own story.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And it brings an interesting topic of discussion, I think, of you have something that's an established world, but yet is an established world that is created initially by an individual person. With Game of Thrones, obviously George R. Martin. With Star Wars, George Lucas. So you start from these beginnings of an individual with a concept creating a world, and then it grows to become something more. And especially in medium like television for most of this, or film, or what have you, there's so many moving pieces that get added on into the process. So the question becomes, at what point do we expect a certain level of input and consideration for the audience, and at what point is it a matter of this is a work of art and we need to respect it as much?
That's definitely a factor to consider. A counter.
No, absolutely.
counter.
That's what this is all about, is discussion.
And this isn't my counterpoint. This is just the realist in me and the devil's advocate in me. Mm-hmm. You could respect it and wait for George R.R. Martin to make another book. But all that money you can miss out on making, Jared. All that money. It's just right there. You just have to write new stories. That's all you have to do. And then they learned the hard way that that's more difficult than they imagined, I'm sure.
An interesting thing to note there, though, is there's going to be some works of film, media, what have you, that just flat out aren't going to appeal to you, and that's okay. It's okay
absolutely.
to there might be somebody out there who might deem the Playmobil movie as their Citizen Kane. And then there are those.
I'd be scared to meet that person, but I could respect that person.
From what I was reading, apparently Playmobil is like really big in Europe, as opposed, I think, France, I want to say?
I think it was either France or Germany.
Yeah.
Either
so
or.
it's like, it's probably going to be a lot more popular there than, like, say, like America, where we don't really connect to it. Very
True. That being said, I heard it got released months before in Europe, and it didn't do that well there either. But whatever.
Keep in mind, we have nothing negative to say about Playmobil themselves.
You're throwing a disclaimer in there
It's
so we
a
don't
fine
get sued.
product, and please sponsor us. But anyway, that would be the most random sponsor to bust out in the middle of a podcast, would it not?
Make Riff Ponies Playmobiles. I'll buy them. I'll sell them. I don't know.
So, ponies ended.
So yes, good point.
Yes, that's true.
Let's dive into that here. It's 2020 now. So
Current year.
This year, in about a little under 9 months from now, we will be celebrating the 10th anniversary of My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic's first airing. And it's amazing to think about the fact that this series lasted 9 seasons plus a feature film plus specials that aired.
Now we're getting Pony Life.
We'll get to G4.5 later.
I have a lot to say.
But there's that too, that we even got a spin-off, and there's real serious conversation about how the transition to Generation 5 will happen. So, needless to say, I would think it would be safe to say that the series exceeded just about everybody's expectations ever. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, absolutely, that would definitely be the case. I think there was, I can't remember who said it, but there was some, again, unverified. I'm remembering this from paraphrase. I remember some writer from Pony stating that they genuinely believed it was only going to last 1 or 2 seasons. They had no idea how long it was going to last, if it would last. And it's really incredible that it made it 9-10 years of being a cultural phenomenon, and it still is. I mean, it still is an important franchise, and there's a lot of people who are still passionate about it. I'm sure it goes beyond every expectation that the people that were developing Pony thought, the expectation that Lauren Faust probably had. This is probably the last place that everyone thought they were going to end up with this thing that they created or followed or just watched on a random Saturday morning. But for a lot of people, I think they're really glad they did, and it's real. And I said it in so many ways. I'm sorry, I keep rambling here. I said it in so many ways at the Bronies NYC series finale meetup I ran, but I think we're only going to comprehend in about 5 or 10 years, and as we have more time for the glow of Friendship is Magic to wear off, but it's going to hit us at some point in the next 5 or 10 years how important of a cultural thing this show was. It really is. It doesn't right now, so soon after it's been done. It's only been 3 months. We were talking about that, and that blew my mind because it feels like ages longer than that. Mm-hmm. But I think once we have time, distance between Friendship is Magic itself and us, I think us and a lot of people who study this sort of thing are going to realize how big and monumentous and important it was as a cultural thing and as a TV series. I think we might have not taken that for granted, that's the wrong word, but I think we just won't appreciate that until we have time to kind of soak it all in.
But yeah, this whole thing's about like how fan reactions, like, yeah, Pony touched a lot of lives, even to the point of like people dedicated college projects to like make content about My Little Pony. And if I don't know if either of you remember back in 2013 a little thing called Double Rainbow.
I do.
Yes, indeed.
Like, because I remember, like, back in the fandom, like, I remember when that was released and the absolute vitriol people had towards that. Like,
I fun fun.
It's an interesting thing you bring up, because most certainly with fandom creations that are based on a property, that's an interesting topic we can get into here. Is a matter of, is there an expectation within that? And again, this is somebody's essentially, I want to say somebody's pet project, essentially. I guess it would be more than that, considering, it was created for a purpose, for a project, for a grade, literally.
Yeah.
So it's delivering something like that into the stratosphere, I feel like is an interesting boat to be in, because you can never fully predict how people will react, and especially when you have it tied to an already existing property.
because like I remember like when it came out, like I watched it and I'm like, wow, that was like for a fan project, like that was amazing, and I can go tell that like they put their hearts into that project. And then I saw like the comments and what everyone was saying about it, and I'm just like, whatever happened to friendship is magic here?
I think there are, in terms of Double Rainbow, I remember my experience with it, and gosh, this feels like walking down fandom memory lane now. I remember my experience with it was that I kind of followed the development of it when I first got into the fandom, which was like when I really dove into the fandom, which was end of 2011, early 2012. I think it had been in progress by then. And then I really started following it after BronyCon 2012, where I think I could be misremembering this entirely, but I remember there was a panel at the main hall where they were talking about it and showing animatics of it, and it was like, wow, this looks great. This looks like an episode. I remember watching it with a group of friends, and they're former friends now. One of them for whatever reasons, another for even more whatever reasons. You can take that as you will. And I remember one of them being really like disheartened about it and being like, God, that sucked. And the other was just like, eh. And I remember with me, and even to this day, I think there are definitely some legitimate criticisms that you could level at Double Rainbow, only in that it advertised itself as a fan-made episode, and there was some promotional things where they were like, oh, it would fit seamlessly with the other episodes, to which people would then point out, and they'd have a genuine quibble. Then they point out, well, when would the Powerpuff Girls ever appear in a My Little Pony Friendship is Magic episode?
They do have the Faust connection, however.
Right. For me, I don't hate it. I know there's people who genuinely hate it. And for me, I remember watching it and finding it nice. It was cute. Yeah. I liked it. It was a good piece of fan animation. It may have been a victim of advertising and promises too big to keep, possibly. Because I don't remember everything that was said in the lead up. But I remember there were some things when you pick at it now, hindsight, as it were, and in a project that's probably constantly changing because it's a fan animated project. Yeah, there were probably things that changed from the expectation.
So it's essentially No Man's Sky.
I was going to say, I was almost going to make that comparison. I decided against it, but yeah, that it kind of is. And in the end, though, I think it's a good piece of fan animation that a lot of people worked on, and a guy worked on.
Like, I look back on my school projects back in animation, and I'm just like, they did 5 times better than I would ever do.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I get why some people who really had like their hearts attached to that thing, and again, this is a point that I'm going to go at a lot during this, is they invested a lot of themselves into this project, just like any kind of fan invests themselves in a fandom and a piece of media, sometimes maybe a little bit too much. And I think people just maybe got their hopes up for what was, by all accounts, a fan animation, as we keep saying and as I keep reiterating. But it's true. It was a very big fan animation.
You know, it's an interesting point you bring about looking back on things, because regardless of anybody's individual opinion on the project itself as a work of media, it is indubitably part of the history of the Brony fandom.
For sure, yeah.
So you can look at it arguably as a stepping stone almost in, I would almost say, the legitimizing of the fandom as a cultural phenomenon, in that these types of projects, regardless of whether they are good artistically or not, and we can debate that all night until the cows come home, they exist, which is more than can be said about other series, other properties, other pieces of media. This was something that generated the interest of individuals to put together a project on this, that encouraged people to start making music about the show and themes surrounding the concept of bronyism in general, all of this. So when we're looking at fan creations, I think there's, and this is to your point that you raised earlier, Thoth, is in a few years from now, when we look back on this, we're not just looking back on the series itself, we're looking back on a history of fandom, a history of a movement, and the pieces that fall within it. And some might age well, some might not age well, but the bottom line is they still existed as a part of history, much in the same regard that people can look back to early Star Trek fandom and look at early, like, some things that some people might cringe at and other people might love. Kirk Spock slash fiction was a big thing at one point in time for a segment of that fandom. And you can cringe at it all you want if that's not your thing, but it was something that existed and catered to people and kept momentum going upon many of the other things that are fabulous about Star Trek, which there are many, and Picard is premiering soon, and I can't wait, except I don't have CBS All Access, but that's a whole other topic of conversation.
Or one of my
it's funny. It's funny. Actually, and that relates, because I was just going to bring up the Star Trek franchise and how it relates to this. And there is a friend of mine, he was a former co-org of Bronies NYC, which I'm now one of the co-orgs of. I'm keeping the ship afloat as long as I can. And he, a big thing that he has talked about is that we definitely should keep it afloat, because when G5 eventually comes around, a similar thing that happens with Star Trek, where there will be a lull in content, but then the series will revive. There will be a new reboot of it. You'll have Enterprise, Deep Space Nine. That's not the right order, of course. Don't come at me, Trekkies. Sorry. Or Star Trek Discovery. When these new series come out and the new content eventually comes out after lulls in activity, my friend, he's made a similar point, and he has very good intel on it, because he's been following the show since the original in the 60s. He's been a Trekkie for his entire 50 plus year life. And he talks about how he's seen it himself, where the fandom will go quiet, will not create much for a while, and then will explode back into activity and creativity and interest when a new series comes around, because there's new content, there's new popular culture interest, there's media interest, there's people covering it again. When people talk about how, this is the end and the G5, it's just gonna go back to being a little girl's show, which the purpose of My Little Pony is always going to be to sell toys to little girls. That's the first key thing to remember for anybody listening out there. But the second is, of course, they're going to take what they've learned from friendship is magic and apply it to this. They're not going to go back to what they did previously because they've seen what works. So I definitely think you will see a resurgence of interest and creativity that maybe not on par with the explosion that the creation, I guess the advent of the Brony fandom had. But you're definitely going to see new people come in, people who are interested. Maybe it'll be on Netflix, maybe new eyes will see it. And then you'll have people who are like, hey, I watched the show and made music for it back in 2012, 2013. Now I want to do that again because there's new stuff, there's new things I can connect to.
The interesting thing, since with Star Trek and My Little Pony here, I think, is we've seen it in both fandoms where change is always controversial. And change in general is scary and stress-inducing. That's just natural human physiology, human psychology. No matter what the change is, regardless of whether it's good or bad, we're going to have stress hit our body. And it's a matter of how we react to it. But there's a point to be made about, or at least to ponder, with when change comes, what do we do about it? How do we react, and can we hold it within, or are we always going to explode?
Definitely, I saw a lot of that concern right around the time when I suppose we can talk about this because the franchise is over with, but there was no better indication of that fear of change and something different coming when that first sheet of concept designs for G5 came around.
Yes, indeed.
Yep, and everybody exploded into, why is Twilight an Earth Body now? Why is Fluttershy a unicorn now? Why is that? This isn't what I like. Change is naturally going to happen, and there has to be something new. And I think you definitely, that's natural, as you said. It's a part of life. It's a part of popular culture too. I think we're definitely at this particular community is, I guess, I don't know if this is the right word, but privileged, I guess, in that we are following a franchise that, like Doctor Who and like Star Trek, has had multiple iterations and both metaphorical and literal regenerations that have kept interest and creativity and kept it different over time. So I think some people, as I said, when I saw the first sheet of concept art that changed a bunch of things that we had really grown to love and be comfortable with over the last 8-9 years, I definitely, and another thing to keep in mind is that it's concept art. It's not going to be that as a final thing. But again, that the whole leak and everything threw an extra wrench into the thing.
Oh, indeed. On the topic of change here, it's interesting some of what we've been discussing as far as the franchises we've touched upon. You just mentioned Doctor Who, which is an excellent recent example of a big change. We had the first female Doctor, and it was all the hubbub for a while leading up to the premiere. And now, granted, we're in the US, not the UK. I only know so much about Whovian lore, and I don't actually actively watch the series myself. Not that I'm opposed to, it's just that my laundry list of things to watch is ever expanding, and it's hard to fit more in. That being said, unless you guys have had different experiences, I have yet to hear anything recently about spewing off negatively or really just commenting about the fact that of the new Doctor. And so there can be that argument of, is it the fear of change that makes us more reactionary and lash out initially? And then once we get accustomed to it, we're able to calm down because now it's not scary and new. We might still not like it, but it's not new anymore. It's like, okay, it came out. I'm not a fan. I'm going to step aside. I'll calm down on my own time. So it's something to ponder. It's one of the great things about social science, is, there's a lot we can kind of pinpoint and look at within interactions of different emotions and psychological elements and sociological elements that would all combine together to impact this. And I could definitely argue that definitely stress and fear of change is always something that's going to impact us individually. And yeah, it might sound like crazy to be like, okay, I'm just overanalyzing how somebody reacts to a show, but I don't think it's overreacting or overanalyzing, I should say, when people's reactions have literally been sending death threats to, say, the director of My Little Pony based on seeing an early cut of the finale.
Yeah, that's a fun topic. I was going to make kind of a comparison in what you were saying about that fear of change, in that I would almost draw, again, you're the social scientist here, Jer. I'm not. I'm just a film studies major guy who knows a little bit about psychology. Basically a college student. Anywho, but one thing I would posit is it almost feels like, in that sort of cause effect of fear and anger and denial, and then eventual acceptance after you realize it's not going to change back, it almost sounds like the stages of grief when you think about it.
It's an interesting point to make. I think when we get into topics on grief, it always is, of course, important to remember that stages of grief are not necessarily absolute for all, and that they can occur in any order. And they might not even occur at all, depending on who you are. And there's a lot of different theories that relate to it. I know you're speaking of the Kubler-Ross model, which is a very commonly known one. And to be blunt, since we're talking about My Little Pony, the episode Tanks for the Memories point blank pinpoints all 5 stages of the Kubler-Ross model of grief, and making the analogy of a dying pet. Granted, we all know Tank didn't die. He just hibernated, though we didn't see much of him the rest of the series after that.
Nope.
I didn't think about that until literally just now. Oh, rest in peace, Tank. We love you. Oh, best tortoise.
I was going to say, you better not say turtle.
Tortoise.
Thank you for that, Shy. There is that sense of, with change, I think there's always that innate fear of what is ending, dying, you could say.
Right.
Not everybody would, but you could say it is just like that.
I definitely played off the whole thing of the show ending for a while, leading up to it with, it's not the end of the world. People will still make fan stuff. Stop worrying. It only began to hit me about a week or two after the series itself ended, where I legitimately felt, I guess I had a delayed reaction, where this really major part of my life and something that made me really happy and this big source of positivity and creativity and like brightness that the show really stood out to me in my head, that not a lot of media, in my opinion, has out there at the moment, was over. And I likened it to a couple people, and I think I posted about it at some point. It felt like, as you just said, it felt like I'd lost like a close friend. And it felt really weird, because even as a person who really loves film and cinema, I can't say that there's a lot of media that I have felt that way about. I'm sure people will still check out whatever clip shows, anything that will keep us in that headspace and remind us of that feeling. And that's what the fan animation and the artwork does, because I think we're all, whether we like it or not, we are connected to this piece of media now. And that's a really interesting thing to me.
Still waiting for that Fallout Equestria game to come out. Waiting for how long?
Though, so many points we can pick up with off of this. Let's dig a little bit into the series finale itself, and then we'll talk about reactionism to it. Personally, I love the way the show ended, and when I say that, I particularly want to bring up the epilogue episode that is the official final episode, where we go look into the future, and we get some questions answered, but a lot not answered, and a lot hinted at. Very intentionally so.
Right. This is going to be not tough, but I gotta say, I have not talked about this episode much with a lot of people since I watched it for a very specific reason.
Oh, I will flat out say I cried my eyeballs out like I was a 2-year-old when I watched it, and I am not ashamed of it whatsoever.
There are multiple. This is another plug. Checks in the mail, Little Shy FIM. Great, amazing guy. He did a vlog of that Bronies NYC event that I helped put on. It was really like the finale it was the finale of the series. And there's just multiple clips of me in there after watching it where I was just a mess. I'm usually pretty composed. Don't cry much often at movies. Don't cry much at a lot. That had me bawling.
Although I think, like, afterwards, once, like, certain details were pointed out, like, Applejack wearing Granny Smith's scarf.
Oh,
yeah, I didn't notice that.
Apple Bloom
was wearing. Okay.
Yep.
It was just like my heart.
There's a thing, I think, that how all of us inherently want to know more. It is basic human nature. You want to learn more about your surroundings. You need to for survival instincts and such, but it's for many of us, when we get so on board with something, we need to know everything about it. So there's a lot of people that will see something like that last episode and be like, I want answers. Is this canon? Or is that what you're saying? And they very purposely did not do it. And they've basically come out and made statements saying as such that we're not going to answer certain questions. We left it that way for you, the fans, so the community has something to work with, so that there is a future to this fandom. Because it's basically, I can't remember who exactly said it, but it essentially was, it's in our hands now as a community.
Yeah.
The show is now in our hands. And you can argue, yes, it's largely IDW has a lot to say right now with the comic books, but, ultimately they have to run everything by Hasbro anyway. But the community always had something brewing even while the show was still running. Things that would become fan fictions, and then people would make that their headcanons. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I mean, we could do a whole episode, I'm sure, about Derpy and Ditsy Doo and whether or not we want to make it canon that Derpy has a child because it's adorable and it makes a great example. But there was so much that gets there that you can run with. Is Apple Dash real now? Was it enough to say yes, it's canon, or no, it's not? And I don't think it matters personally. I think that's up to the individual to run with. And the fact that we can even have conversations about what these things represent, we saw Sandbar and Yona together in a house. That doesn't mean necessarily that they got together. It just means that they're still friends. Theoretically, there's so much you can look into with all of that.
It was kind of like the same thing with Octavia and Vinyl Sketch.
Well, exactly, because we basically got them as roommates in Slice of Life, and I believe we as a community accepted it, but still some of us had them as our OTP. Granted, my OTP switched to Libon in that moment, and that one actually did become canon. So
there you go. You come from a very charmed position, Jared.
Indeed.
Your headcanons are confirmed and all that good stuff.
It's yeah, it was pretty. It almost made me tear up some to see it. I actually did get spoiled on the proposal shot earlier, like weeks before it happened. But it was in such, like, I saw it and I assumed it was real, but at the same token, my head debated, is this actually real, or is this something
or fan art?
Because, well, let's face it, there's some really talented people in the community. I mean, I swear to God, if half of what Pixel Kitties makes, I could easily see being a still from the show. If it weren't for the fact that it was all crossed over with DuckTales and other franchises. Which, by the way, Pixel Kitties, we love you, Monica. You're a sweetheart, and we would love to work with you again. But I digress.
Maybe we can get her on.
In time.
The check is in the mail. A lot of checks in the mail.
Podcast. I'll be your host today.
Although granted, I guess on a panel of or podcast of fan reactions, I guess it is good to talk about the actual fans.
The actual people.
Well, yes. And so going back to fan reactions, we talked about the idea of wanting it to be canon and asking for answers. We'll bring up kind of the elephant in the room subject of the finale, which was in the days and weeks leading up to the airing of the finale on Discovery Family in the United States. The episode had aired in a couple other countries, and some people got early cuts thanks to that. And
well, I mean, originally it just straight up leaked, and I believe it was by mistake that had happened, or at least in English.
Mm-hmm. Suffice to say, with the leaks and the airings internationally early, some people were not pleased with how the final episode turned out, which is in and of itself not necessarily an issue. Where it turns into an issue is when that is how far some will go with the reaction. In the case of Big Jim Miller, as has been most of our audience probably is already aware of this, but that he received some very, very harsh emails, messages, etc., and almost left social media over it for a little bit. And it was very rough. He actually shared at least one of the messages that he received, and it was very pointed, very cruel. And this brings us to the point of having to ask ourselves, what is it that drives us to react so violently, just hate-filled and extreme, and to send out things on a personal level to people that are so charged? And I don't necessarily mean you and I when I say us, but I mean our fellow man, our fellow woman, our fellow fan, fellow human being, fellow community member. They are part of this community too, and it's easy to write it off and say they're just some loser who just doesn't get it and yada yada. But if we want to unite stronger as a community, as a fandom, as a world of individuals coming together, we got to ask ourselves the tough question of what brings this out on people, and what do we do to kind of deal with it. And I have some theories on my own, but I'd love to hear everyone else's opinion on it.
I've really been hammering away at a point in the first half of this where I've been saying people like to get really invested in the media that they like. I think there is a threshold where people get very attached to the media that they like. Um, to give a pretty good example, you see plenty of those stories through the fandom culture of people who harass crew members or VAs, and I don't mean the death threat variety that Jim Miller got, but just people who maybe don't make the correlation that the VAs are, regular people just doing a job voicing a multicolored pony. It means more to them than that. That is a part of their life. And that human being is not a human being who's just voicing these characters for a living. They are that character. And the show is their life. Of course, there are people who are just going to do that because they're kind of just, angry or they're nasty just by their personality type, I guess. And there's people who are trolls. But there are some people where the show, a piece of media, means that much to them that if it's not to their liking, then they will get that angry and that nasty and that, as you said, Jer, pointed. I think it's very, as much as we love pieces of media, I always make sure to bring it back around however I feel about an episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, because I hear other people's reactions and there will be really positive ones and there'll be I've heard really angry takes on episodes of Pony. Of course I won't name names, but I've heard people just call writers names, derogatory ones, in chats, in text, whatever. And I always just kind of go back to the point with any of those people when they go into those kind of rants of, it's just a show. And I know that's maybe be a naive thing to say, but maybe not it's just a show, but rather remember that it is a show. For a lot of people, My Little Pony Friendship is Magic was a pretty important part of their lives, maybe even their lives. I know it's become a part of my life, pretty much. But I think we really have to remember that when we get invested in a piece of media and the fandom and the culture surrounding it, we do have to remember not to lose ourselves in that, I think. To some people, it just meant that much to them, and when it wasn't to their liking, it upset them and confused them and made them angry. And that's fine. I mean, I had two friends who saw some of the leaks when they dropped, and they took one look at an image that I never saw what they saw. I'm gonna wager a guess that maybe they saw the picture of future Princess Twilight, and I remember their expressions getting really oh, and they were really it was interesting. And I was talking to them. I was telling them, people are sending Jim Miller death threats. They're doing this and that. It's pretty insane. And they gave me an answer of, yeah, death threats aren't okay, but they did break a bunch of promises of the original crew. And I'm like, yeah, but there really shouldn't be a yes but for death threats.
So kind of bouncing on the toxic fans, or the directing anger towards the show staff. I know I actually recently saw an episode of American Dad that the whole premise of the episode was everyone was so invested in this football game, and now all of a sudden their star player can't play, and basically the team's just we're not playing anymore because we're gonna lose, essentially. So the entire town takes the blame off, or takes all of their anger out on what is it, Steve,
Right.
and it's just it kind of brings up the point of the reason why they act this way is because it's an escape from just the grind of our lives, and it's like it's a thing that just brings us genuine joy, and now all of a sudden that thing isn't there anymore. So unfortunately, one of the first things people do is get angry, especially when
Right.
it's not going the way that they want to go.
Right.
Yeah, definitely a few pieces on the reactionism. Speaking from a perspective of a psychological perspective, when you get information and that will come at you, especially in for anything that's challenging what you know, or is something that's approaching you, whether it be physically or emotionally or what have you, mainly physically, I would say, or just visually, that you tend to react with the part of your brain that is the emotional centers of your brain, first and foremost. That is where you will have your initial reaction. It takes longer for the logic centers of your brain to kick in than the emotional. So a lot of times it seems that what we do as people is we ride that emotion. We don't give it the time to get the logic going so we can balance the two. And want to always add, whenever I talk about this, it's important to feel the emotion, to have it, to embrace the fact that you are having it. However, you need to also keep in mind you're not thinking logically in your first gut reaction usually, because your brain hasn't kicked in those centers yet. So in something like watching the finale of a series, you can get angry and get upset and not enjoy it, and then also take a moment, breathe, and realize this isn't the end of your world, and you can discuss what you don't like about it without having to go on the offensive. One thing I will really
Yeah.
respect Jim for doing is he did come out and say that if somebody wants to have a discussion on a civil discussion with him on things that they didn't agree with in the finale, he is more than willing to have that discussion with people. And that is big of a person to say, who was getting as such vitriol as he was. And I commend
Yeah.
him for it.
Yeah. Absolutely. I ended up talking super briefly with Jim Miller at Cider Fest. We're talking like 2 minutes. Um, Talking to him there, there was a lot to say. A lot I had to say about the kind of vitriol that he faced. But really, all that people were telling him at Cider Fest, and all of the crew that was represented, that those people, that the guests were representing the crew at Cider Fest, it was just love for all of them all that weekend. And I think people were well aware of the initial vitriolic response he got, and were trying to make up for that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it less make up and more show how much I guess the fandom at heart really appreciated what they did and what Jim did. And I say they because Jim always said it was an everybody effort and not just a him effort, and that really is true.
Oh yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I have mad respect too for. I've noticed posts on social media that share, here are the storyboard artists for this episode and such. And to be honest, I would love to see more individuals like storyboard artists or behind the scenes people at pony conventions. That's right, I'm talking to you, pony conventions. Because
nameless pony convention
yeah,
2020.
wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
I don't know which one we're referring to. I genuinely don't.
No, I'm not referring to anyone in specifically, but it is a thing of I've been fascinated, and it's really made me kind of grow in appreciation over the years. Attending pony conventions and getting to talk to writers, getting to talk to the voice acting director, not just the voice actors. These individuals who are really the behind the scenes, muscle behind getting the show put together, and
Right.
hearing about the process and how many individuals will touch just a single episode of My Little Pony. How many individuals will work on an episode of Game of Thrones? How many individuals put themselves into making a new Star Wars movie, etc., etc. And how when a script gets written by any of the writers that worked on the show, like we'll stick with Pony for the main example here and say Emily Larson or GM Barrow writes a script. They send that off to get approved. They'll get notes, do rewrites. Script is finally approved and sent forward. Voice actors at that point will do their recordings. They will get directed on those recordings. Those get sent over. It gets storyboarded. Animation team looks at it. They have to construct it for time. They have to send it to Hasbro, get their opinion. By the time it gets to us, the initial writer, whoever it may be, M.A. Larson, G.M. Barrow, Josh Haber, etc., they most likely have no idea what is still left of their original script. They only know when it airs on TV. I've had that told to me by one of the writers before, and I'm not sure who it was. But it's that they send it off, they hope for the best, that what they wrote is good, but they don't know 100% what's going to make it and how it's going to be translated fully until it ends up airing on television. Which is, it sounds a little crazy almost, and I don't think a lot of us think about that, about how many different hands touch it and how something may be a great concept initially, but by the time it went through as many channels as it does, it could turn into something that isn't as strong of a product, or vice versa. There could be a weaker script that gets turned into something amazing. And it makes me look back at episodes that I may not love, episodes where I think could have more or better, and thinking at some point in the process there may have been more.
Yeah.
A great.
I mean, it's as somebody who's learned that whole more so. I learned more on the film angle of things, but I definitely also had some education in television production as well and television writing. And I would love the opportunity to talk to some of the writers from the show, just not about the writing on Pony, but just not just that, but also writing for television in general, because I still have a million questions.
Oh yeah.
But knowing how that process goes, from not only the writers talking about it, but also just being, I guess, being educated in that there's so many people that are involved down that line that you look at the credits of a regular episode of Pony very differently when you finally have that perspective of how many people touch it, how many people don't know what their work is going to look like until they see it air the day of. Is really incredible.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of time and effort spent, and whether or not a piece of art is good, I feel is always objective. We can argue about that till the cows come home, which apparently is going to be a catchphrase at this point, because I've said it like 3 times on this podcast. But,
hey, that's a rule of 3.
Yep. Or I shouldn't say objective. I meant to say subjective. I really don't feel like there's such a thing as complete objectivity. There's always subjectivity, and in the way we consume media, because I feel every person consumes media slightly differently. And I'm actually going to steer a conversation back to Star Wars, because I feel that this is the one area I felt most recently that the way that you are watching the films is going to partially dictate your feelings on it, or at least heavily impact them. Because I know you've mentioned, you weren't even sure if you were going to go see the new Star Wars originally, Thoth, and
right.
And I know, Rose, I think for you, you looked forward to it, but didn't give yourself any high expectations one way or the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for me, I think I tried to keep my expectations low. but I noticed, reflecting back on the film after I saw it, how I consumed it as I feel differently than some other people did. Because I feel if you consumed it looking a little more analytically, a little more. I'm not saying it's bad to analyze things. Trust me, I'm basically analyzing a whole series of things right now.
There you go.
But
I was gonna say that's what you do, Jared.
so it's, if you're looking for things, if you went in with an expectation like you expected it to be bad, if you were looking for, now granted, I know there were things I was looking for too. And I think that there's a certain amount of, if you go into a film with check boxes or an episode or what have you, and that, like, I hope it does X, Y, Z. And if it doesn't do that, it kind of flips that switch of like, oh my goodness, like, no, this is bad. Like, I'm just rawr, rawr, rawr.
Right.
I noticed for me with episode 9, and really, I feel all of the new trilogy, I consumed it very emotionally. That, in particular, episode 9 for me was an emotional experience. Again, I cried. Again, not ashamed to say, I cried. There were some things. The big thing to me was I was very curious, especially with Carrie Fisher passing away, what they were going to do with Leia's story and pan out. And they were kind of like, I feel like those were kind of like those check boxes of, I want to feel like they showed something with the characters they had in there. And, and again, characters like, I think Rey finally got a chance to show some different emotion than we saw from her in 7 and 8. And a lot of different things. And I'm not going to argue about why I enjoyed the film the way I did, other than the fact of saying I feel that it hit me in the right emotional spots, and I was able to thoroughly enjoy the moment. Now, I recognize that others did not get the same sense, and I feel that their opinions are incredibly valid as well. I know you and I definitely probably had a different take on the film, Mr. Pantwell.
I was gonna say I'm just sitting here in the naughty corner because I'm about to share my opinion on it once you're done, and it's going to be very different. But
exactly.
But the thing of it is that whenever I publish my reviews here and there, and I talk about what movies I really like and which I do not like, and despite, I remember, Jer, you were pretty open with me immediately where you said you really loved it in reply to my very critical and very negative review. And I was completely open where I immediately said, I'm actually really happy that people are enjoying it. Because, what kind of world would it be if everybody had the same exact opinion on it? It would be a boring. That's what it would be. Mm-hmm. And not only that, people, as you said, people see media through a different individual lens. Everybody looks at a different piece of media different. Once I started accepting that, especially because I dabble in film criticism and everything, once I started accepting that, that sense of outrage that a lot of people get when they see someone give a movie a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star review that they think is a 10 out of 10 you lose that kind of sense of outrage once you realize, maybe they just had a different mindset. Maybe they looked at it differently. What experiences do they have that maybe shapes their opinion one way or the other about it? So, yeah, I think everybody looked at it differently. But continue what you were saying, because you see it very differently than I do.
Yeah,
and I appreciate
it was
that.
definitely very much an emotional experience. And here's the thing, too, is I can recognize it's not a perfect film by any stretch of the imagination. And it's kind of one of those, in a perfect world where I could, make some changes, I probably would alter a few things. I mean, I'm one of those rare people who actually liked episodes 7, 8, and 9. Now, granted, again, I'm not saying any of them are perfect films. I just appreciated them for what they had. And again, granted, in a perfect world, we probably would have had it different. We might have had instead of the tonality differences between the various films is definitely things to look at when you view it as a collective trilogy. There's a lot of things we can talk about, and and some of which would be really more nitpicky than others, but the bottom line is, at the end of the day, I was able to get enjoyment out of it. And it was an interesting experience for me because I saw a lot of people did not enjoy it. Now I know, Rose, you and I saw it together, obviously.
Yep.
And I know you enjoyed it. However, I think you were probably slightly more critical of it than me.
Yes.
So, kind of like, what's your takeaway on a property like that, and kind of how you feel you experience a piece of media?
I think I experienced it very, very emotionally first, but like pretty much right after the film, then like my logic kicks in, and then like I start thinking about things like was it consistent? Was it like, was there any plot holes? And sadly, like sometimes that can kind of bring my enjoyment of it down, but like overall, I enjoyed the film.
Mm-hmm. I've had a couple of moments. I realized with this film, I was on the opposite end of the spectrum as I was from the My Little Pony movie.
Right.
Where a lot of people were praising it that I knew, and I really didn't like it. I still don't like it, but but I've learned to relax about it for many of the reasons we've already discussed in the podcast, being that I know how many hands went into it. I know that they worked hard. It may not, in my opinion, it may not be some of the best work. There's other work I appreciate more, but I know they tried and they put in effort, and I will commend them for doing that. I know the book that is available out there of the art of the My Little Pony movie actually goes into detail on things that were originally proposed and being worked on that didn't make the final cut. And, I look at things like that and go, there maybe was a version of it that I would have loved. I don't know. I'll never fully know. But I can appreciate all the hands that went through and made what came out. And I also realized I don't want to take away anyone else's joy. If somebody watched that film and had emotional connection to it, and it impacted them, or it made them smile, or made them happy, who am I to take that away from them?
Although I think one thing to be said is, I think a big part of how you consume media also depends on your expectations. Where, like, when I went into Star Wars, I thought it was going to be a decent film. Like, I didn't expect it to be anything great or anything terrible, and that's essentially what I got. And I think the same thing with the Pony movie was, I didn't really have the highest of expectations. I was just kind of expecting a cute movie, and once again, that's kind of what I got. So,
and I'll be honest, I really think, and this I think really sums a lot of what we've been talking about up in this kind of sentiment of how I felt originally when I went into the Pony movie, is here was this franchise that I loved, and this fandom and this movement that meant the world to me. And I've kind of felt like I viewed the movie as like, this is the chance to show everybody what this is all about, and it should be the greatest of the great, and it should embody what the show is at its core and at its greatest. And I know I had a lot of high expectations and going in, and whether or not they're fair, again, we could argue. I just know that I did, and I think what I wanted was more than just a good movie. I think what I wanted was something to use beyond being just a film. I wanted something to be a culturally significant moment, which is putting a lot of expectations on a film that is an extension of a show that is made to sell toys to young girls.
Expectation is a big word and a big factor in how we all kind of receive film, any kind of media, film, television, any kind of media, and especially plays into how fans and big fandoms receive this media. Expectations and the attachment and whatnot. I think what we're really getting at in the last few subjects we're talking about is not that there is a right way and a wrong way to receive media, whether you love it or hate it or feel just indifferent about it. But I think it could definitely be said that there is a healthy way of going about it and a not so healthy way of like going about it or receiving it.
I think an interesting thing that plays in our modern world is with the advent and rapid growth of the internet and social media over the last 20-25 years, we've developed beyond what we used to have, but we haven't changed, I don't think, that much. There was always a sense of you go to a movie, you see it, you hate it, and you complain about it. But now we can connect more directly to the people who make the product. It's
That
very
is
simple.
the thing
to
of
do it.
social media. Yeah.
And where instead of just complaining about it to our friend, because before, you would have had, if you really wanted to get something to somebody, you would have had to look up the information on how to get a hold of them, sit down and either write a letter, book a plane ticket, and go stalk them at their house, which would probably get you arrested. But point being, it was much more of an effort to make. Now we have the instant gratification element. And I'm not saying that it's the internet's fault. Far from it, in fact. I feel it's just a natural transition of we've always said these things and thought these things. We just now can be more pointed and directed because we have more access to the individuals involved. So, but I feel that the thing we all have to keep in mind within that is we don't always know the full story. We don't always know what happened in the process. We don't always know who really is to blame. We have a culture that does love to place blame where they can. And a lot of it is a matter of protecting our own self-esteem internally. That when we look to something that we feel doesn't jive with our own personal perception of how it should be, we're looking for a reason for it to get our brain to calm down and go, okay, it's not my fault that it's bad. It's not my fault that I don't like it. It's X person's fault for making this a bad movie. It's X person's fault for changing the script, for not hiring the right cast, for getting the wrong director. What have you? It's a lot easier to do that than to look internally. Now, I'm not saying there's anything bad internally either. I think sometimes we just have to accept there are things we like and things we don't like, and that's okay. And we can talk about what we don't like. We can talk about it in a critical manner without being hostile and making it personal.
Yeah.
And that's the real challenge I think we all face right now, is keeping a calm mind in these moments. And one thing I've often told people, especially with social media and reactionism to posts on social media, is if somebody says something or you see something that upsets you, that bothers you, that hurts you, and you need to get the emotion out, do it. Write it out if you need to. Think it out, type it out, and then stop. Do not hit the enter key. Do not click the send button. Go back, look at what you just wrote, and think about it. Give yourself a moment for your logic center to kick in. Run it through a couple checks. Ask yourself, is this something you'd want somebody saying directly to you? And the other check I always like to kind of keep in the back of my mind, run it through the elements of harmony. Does it jive with the elements of harmony? They're called the elements of harmony for a reason. These are factors that go to a harmonious relationship, to harmonious friendship, to keeping us together, to keeping friendship magic. Name drop. Anyway.
Congrats.
Roll credits. But they're there for a reason. They were created like that for a reason. And it's things to keep in mind. And I'm not saying that the elements of harmony are all encompassing, but it's a good start. And if you think about what you're going to say before you say it. You have that luxury online. You have the
Yeah.
energy, the send button. Those are your friends. You can choose what you send and what you don't send. If you need to, get it out. Vent your frustration. Maybe talk to somebody about it. And then think about how you really want to say to get your point across. Because when you come across as angry and complaining, a lot of times the only point you make is that you're angry and complaining. You're actually not getting your point across to the other person as to what you want to see being changed and what it was that bothered you. If you're calling somebody a bleepity bleepity bleep, all they get is, okay, well, this person's angry and they have an attitude and they're just cursing me out, instead of going, oh, well, I see what they're talking about with this scene. I understand their perspective. It's not mine. You could get real dialogue going if you allow for it to happen instead of just going to the nth degree.
Right. I think, and that's all completely correct. Very poignant at that poignantly said at that. I think it relates back to what I was saying, is not that there is a right or wrong way to go about receiving and reacting to this media or just consuming whatever in general. But I definitely think there is a helpful and healthy way of going about it, and a not as helpful and not as healthy way to go about it. And I mean, to kind of relate to what you are getting at, and to kind of put it back into the pony perspective for a moment. One of the things for full disclosure, I loved the way the series concluded. I was a bigger fan of the final episode than the two-parter of 24 and 25, although those were good as well. One of the issues I had with it was the particular decision to not redeem the villain trio for multiple reasons that I could get into. I wasn't as big of a fan of it, but I accepted it. I shrugged and I went, well, they saw it differently. And eventually, when I was at Cider Fest and they had a particular conversation about that, someone brought that up and asked how particularly Jim Miller, how they weighed that decision, arcs and a story beat. You concluded multiple things right there in that motion of turning them to stone instead of, say, redeeming them or what have you. And Jim Miller gave a reasonable, rational answer that changed my mind on it and made me say, you know what? I didn't think of it that way, and maybe that's not the way that I would agree with that arc ending, but I'm fine with it. So I think my ultimate point in that, and I think what you are getting at as well, is we just have to take a moment like that to hesitate, think on it before we start just raining hellfire upon whatever we like or don't like, or people that disagree with us, and just think of healthier ways to go about expressing that. Understand that people see it a different way. The people who made it might see it a different way. You might be the one person that sees it differently this way. You might be one of millions of people who see it that way. But it's like I told you, Jared, when you first. I think it's fair of me to bring it up. You were really afraid of the reaction that you were going to get from other people about how you felt about the Pony movie.
Mm-hmm.
And no less than about a year later, we were running a panel at BronyCon talking about how we all felt about the Pony movie. 3 or 4 of us really enjoyed it. You were the one there who didn't, and we had. I wish I had video of it. We had a intelligent, well-mannered, reasonable conversation about.
Indeed.
in terms of the movie.
Yep. It's and this is the thing I want to keep. I kind of want to throw in is
You're good.
having different opinions is good. It
It
keeps
really
the
is.
world interesting. It keeps it moving. If we all agreed, I don't think we'd make it long term. It's
It'd be
a
a very, very boring world.
there's I'm gonna paraphrase something from Stevie Nicks of all people. Interestingly enough, I know I think Thoth, I will never cease to amaze you with the randomness I can pull my references from.
I'm rolling with it.
So Stevie Nicks had an album called Trouble in Shangri-La. I want to say in the late '90s, early 2000s, and it's a great album, by the way. Check it out, people. I'm doing more name
should.
drops, checks in the mail. So
Really good album.
it really is. So in an interview, she said something to the extent of, you have to have trouble in Shangri-La to appreciate Shangri-La. So there's almost never going to be a Shangri-La. It's, like you can't ever truly appreciate the great things without seeing trouble, because you won't know that it is great, because you don't know what it's like to be any other way if you've only experienced that. And it's an interesting thing to look at, and that's an interesting thing to comment on is we're going to get bad films, some of which are definitely worthy of being riffed. I won't lie. Hashtag riff dummies. But
Hashtag ad. I don't know if that check is in the mail yet. I think it might have got. But
we'll check on it later. But
okay, gotcha.
Suffice to say, I don't think we'd appreciate the good ones as much if we didn't have the bad ones to compare it to. And then the more just great ones, then you get nitpicky and picking favorites and such. And at the end of the day, it's like, if something touches you, it touched you and it made you feel something. And isn't that really what it's all about?
Where did it touch you?
And that's why it's important when it touches you that deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't always happen.
Yeah, exactly. And a friend of mine showed me a video recently where somebody was making an argument, essentially, of the learning to appreciate movies with plot holes, learning to appreciate movies that are okay, and media that's okay, in the sense of, in the grand scope of things, if you're really consuming a lot of media, you're going to have stuff that's like that. And you can figure out kind of how that happens, where not everything's going to be, the next Citizen Kane, the next, I'm just going to say Mad Max Fury Road because that movie is so freaking awesome. But,
can I just say, it is so interesting that you use that as an example, because I adore that film. But I have a friend who we share many similar film opinions. I showed him that, and he said that may be the film that he hates the absolute most. I showed it to him, and he hated it.
A lot of my close friends and I absolutely love that film. I saw it 3 times in the theaters personally.
I saw it twice in theaters, so I understand.
Yeah, but I showed it actually the second time. We took good friend of mine. We picked up and I, who had already seen it, and we were itching to see it again. We took another friend of ours, and he really didn't like it, but we kind of pieced together that it was the style of storytelling that was presented in that film is not his usual cup of tea. So therefore, he really didn't like it as much, but he didn't diss on us for it, and we kept civil. I think I had to maintain my friend from being like, what? But, it's even a film like that. I mean, that film was nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. Now, granted, using the Oscars is not necessarily the statutation or the ultimate pinnacle, because let's face it. But the point remains is it was a very well received film overall, and some people are just not going to like it. And
Right.
some people are going to love films that are receiving the Razzie Awards each year too. I
Right.
I had to come to a realization at one point when I was initially making the Keeping Friendship Magic project, and I was doing research on other fandoms to try to kind of gather my scope, and see what all I could apply this to. Was I basically made a blanket statement about, what, if somebody gets joy out of a pop culture fandom or phenomenon or a piece of media, then they have every right to enjoy it, and I have no right to judge them for it. And a good friend of mine turned to me and went, "What about Twilight? What about Twihards?" And I had to actually take a moment and think about this. And I went, you know what? I don't get it, but if they're getting something out of it, I'm not going to take it away from them.
Yeah.
And I've actually relaxed a lot more on Twilight since then, and people who like it, because I've realized I was a very angry teenager when it came to that stuff, because I just wanted
Right.
everybody to appreciate the high art of things and this and that, and I was like so anti boy band as a teenager and things like that. And then I look back on this stuff and I'm like, why was I so angry? I mean, I could no. That's a whole other. That's a whole podcast in and of itself. That's probably a whole series. However,
Yeah. Fair.
it's it's just an interesting thing. It's now granted. I'll continue to say I don't get it. I watched like 5 to 10 minutes of that film and it was like I don't get it. But some people do, and it appealed to them, and they got something from it. And if it enriched their lives and made them happy, I'm not going to steal their happiness. We're going to wrap up here, looking at the time. So I'll say, Mr. Thoth Penswell, thank you very much for joining me, as well as Miss Nova Rose. I know we've got some, if you want to talk a little bit, Thoth, about what you have coming up here in the near future.
Well, let's see. Well, we are going to be, and when I say we, I mean Riff Ponies, me and my lovely my partner in crime, and one of my best friends, Essential. We are going to be traveling from this horrible armpit of the country known as New Jersey to Addison, Texas for HarmonyCon, which is going to be in its second year. So tremendously excited. We've got, gosh, I've got a list right in front of me. We've got 5 panels there. Going to be doing some kazooing. Going to be doing some riffing Bad Pony cartoons. Going to be drinking because, of course. We'll see if HarmonyCon lives to regret this decision, but we couldn't be more excited about it. Couldn't be more excited about going to a new convention, to a second year con that hopefully is just going to grow bigger and bigger. And if you're in that area of Texas, Dallas, Fort Worth, I seriously ask you guys to come because there's so much cool stuff that we'll be announcing soon, which, by the way, reminds me, follow us at Riff Ponies on Twitter, because who knows, maybe you get enough followers on there before TrotCon or a big convention, I might show some embarrassing videos of me at Riff Ponies panels because, I love being the butt of the joke. That's the big thing.
Do it.
So, yeah, at Riff Ponies, gonna be at HarmonyCon 2020. That's our next big thing. Also gonna be at BabsCon, but that's whole other hashtag ad.
All right, and Miss Nova Rose, I know we recently learned of a convention you and I will be attending coming up. If you wanted to speak a little on that.
Sure, we will be at ZenkaiCon 2020, and we will be doing the panels Adulting by Sanrio and
Kill a Kill When Fan Service Isn't. Yes.
Long Way.
Yes, indeed. So yes, I do talk about anime too. Myself and Nova Rose will be leading that up come this March, and that's in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. You can always follow us on Twitter, myself at KeepFriendMagic, and my lovely compatriot here.
Oh yes, you can find me at Nova Roselia.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you all for tuning in to our premiere episode. We'll be back soon with episode 2. Thank you, as always, and remember to keep friendship magic. Thank you.